Good afternoon. My name is Ugne Nausedaite, and I am a master's student in Sungkyunkwan University. I am majoring in media communication, and today I will be presenting my research idea, which is the influence of news framing on support of Myanmar's Spring Revolution movement abroad. So first of all, I would like to briefly introduce how I am going to uh, present my idea today. So first of all, I will explain why, in my opinion, this study would be important. Then I will move on to explaining the history of Myanmar's struggle for democracy. Then I will introduce the theoretical background that I gathered for the study, which is mainly based around the framing in protest context. Then I will move on to explain the hypothesis that I came up with for the study. And lastly, I will explain the method that I chose for the study. So first of all, why do I think the study would be important? So the reason why I believe the study would be meaningful is because the Myanmar Spring Revolution movement is something that is happening at the moment. It's happening right now, and it results in deaths and injuries of innocent civilians. And support and interest in this movement from abroad could be a big support and an important push for the military to cease the violence and return to the development of democratic Myanmar. So let me briefly introduce the country that is the focus of my presentation. So Myanmar, also known as Burma, is a Southeast Asian country that shares borders with China, India, Laos, Thailand, and Bangladesh. It was one of the British colonies, later invaded by Japan in 1942, the invasion of Japan lasting until 1945. After World War II, Myanmar succeeded to achieve independence from the British Empire as well and became a republic in 1948. Having adopted a parliamentary democracy system, Myanmar was ruled with the system in place for 14 years until General Ne Win carried out a coup d'etat in 1962. According to Kaling et al., the emergence of military power in the political scene of Myanmar at that time disrupted the democracy implementation process. From then on, a new era of military rule began, during which the country was ruled with a socialist system. Together with the military rule came the self-isolation of Myanmar, as well as a closed-door policy implementation against foreign countries. The use of economic socialist system resulted in a lot of instability in Myanmar's economic situation, despite the fact that the leadership was changed a few times. The lack of development and the dissatisfaction with the situation prompted the people of Myanmar to protest against the military rule. Year 1988 to 1989 saw the most intense rebellions against the military rule. From that time, a lot of significant change took place in the Myanmar's economy, politics, and society. This change was not, however, welcomed by the military, as it posed a challenge to their regime as well as influenced the way the public viewed the military rule. Even though the military made efforts to regain public's favor, none of them really worked in order to achieve that goal. The people continued to march in the streets asking for a proper election and a democratic government. The continuing movement against the military rule forced the military to compromise and offer implementation of open election, named the Democratization of Myanmar. Following that, many parties were formed in order to proceed with the making of a democratic government. Specifically, during this process emerged the now well-known figure in Myanmar's democratic movement, Mrs. Aung San Suu Kyi. She's the leader of one of the political parties, which is called National League of Democracy and shortly referred to as NLD, which received the most votes during the open election. In a similar pattern as the current situation in Myanmar right now, the military did not accept defeat and instead arrested San Suu Kyi for misbehavior, taking over the rule once again. They have arrested many senior leaders of NLD and other opposing figures under false accusation of being a threat to the country's national security at that time. The real beginning of change in Myanmar's politics was in 2011 when Senior General Tan Shwe stepped down from the position as head of state and his successor Thein Sein became the first elected president of Myanmar. The new president worked together with the leader of NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi, and in 2012, NLD won 43 seats out of 45 in the parliament election, and Aung San Suu Kyi became a member of the House of Representatives. In 2016, Aung San Suu Kyi was elected as the State Councilor of Myanmar, this title making her the head of the government. In 2020, NLD once again won the election, winning enough seats to form a government. However, the opposition, which had the support of the military, accused the elections of being faulty. And following that, on the 1st of February of 2021, the military detained Aung San Suu Kyi and other leaders, proceeding to seize control of the country and declaring a one-year emergency situation. Since the coup, the Myanmarese civilians have been protesting daily, and the protests were met with increasing violence and brutality against unarmed civilians. The death toll has since passed 700 victims, and it passed that number in the middle of April. The protests are receiving a lot of international attention from the media, and therefore the framing of the protests, in my opinion, really matters in regards to how foreign countries and the people in foreign countries see this issue and support this movement. So let me briefly introduce and move on to the theoretical background, and I will briefly introduce the framing theory, which I will be using in the study. So Goffman was one of the first scholars to create the definition of framing, defining framing as something that helps individuals organize what they see in their daily lives. In regard to journalism, Gitlin defined framing as a way of how journalists arrange and formulate a vast amount of information into a message that the audience can understand. Then he also argued that frames are patterns of interpretation, presentation, selection, emphasis, exclusion, and cognition. Then, much later, researcher Entman related framing to salience and selection, insisting that framing means selecting particular details of reality and making them more noticeable in communicative text in order to promote a certain definition of the issue at hand and interpretation of reasons why it happened and recommendation of how to treat it or a way to morally evaluate it. Framing, therefore, can have important connotations because it can focus on some aspects of the issue while excluding others, and in result leading the audience to make a certain interpretation of the issue. So therefore, framing is very important when dealing with protests, as the way the protest is framed can result in lesser or bigger support for the movement itself. According to Kilgo and Harlow, recent media research has shown that framing is the factor that predicts the audience's interpretation and engagement most consistently when it comes to social movements such as protests. So MacLeod and Hertog were the researchers who identified four most used key frames used in news articles when covering protests. These four frames are as follows: the riot frame, the spectacle frame, confrontation frame, and the debate frame. The debate frame focuses on the demands of the movement and helps engage audience with the issues protesters want to bring attention to. The riot frame, the frame of disruptive violent behavior, confrontation frame, which is the frame of conflict with authorities or police, and spectacle frame, which is the frame of dramatic sensational narratives, all emphasize action or behavior. So all of these three frames, excluding the debate frame, are emphasizing action or behavior. According to previous research, and contrarily to the debate frame, these three frames withdraw the legitimacy from the protest movement and have negative influence on how the public views the movement. Relating this to the current study, some news articles refer to Myanmar's protest as civil disobedience movement, while many others refer to them as protests or Myanmar Spring. As civil disobedience has a negative connotation to it and implies that there is a conflict between civilians and the authorities, it could be seen as part of the confrontation frame, which is one of the frames that negatively affects public's opinion about protests. Furthermore, looking at researchers Karyotaki and his colleagues' study about the framing of Egyptian Arab Spring, civil unrest was one of the frames that was used during that movement. So, civil unrest is a term that appeared after the coverage of Hurricane Katrina, in which violence, trauma, struggle to survive were supposed to be normal outcomes of the crisis. So, according to the findings of previous studies, the civil unrest frames shows that the period is portrayed as being under the war zone conditions, and all of the protesters are treated as a crowd and are not shown as individuals. Because of that, the audience's perception of the whole movement is easily influenced, either positively or negatively, by the narrative the news articles are portraying. So, following all of this, I have formed the first hypothesis as follows. Referring to Myanmar's protest as civil disobedience movement in the news article will result in less willingness to support the movement than referring to it as Myanmar Spring. So another important frame in protest is the human interest, also known as human impact frame. This frame connects the presentation of an issue or an event to a human face or brings an emotional angle to the presented story. Such presentation makes the public regard the crisis in the story as urgent and serious. As well as that, the emotional response to the crisis depicted in the story might affect the judgment of the audience to thoughtfully evaluate the responsibility for the crisis. Therefore, the use of this frame may be an important attribute in explaining why individuals see some crises as more severe than others and how the emotional impact affects their attribution of the responsibility. Relating this to the current study, news articles that focus on the impact on the people of Myanmar who are participating in the protest against enforced military rule could play a big role in encouraging support for the movement. Attribution of responsibility for this crisis to the military could encourage people abroad who may not be aware of Myanmar's history or the current situation to support the protesters in their struggles for democracy. Therefore, the second hypothesis was formed as follows. News articles with human interest frame, for example, describing the violence occurring against the protesters, will result in more support for the movement than an article without a human frame, without a human interest frame. Another important component of news articles is the visual representation of the issue, the photos that accompany the article. The photographs used in the news have shown to draw public's attention to the articles they appear next to. The type of photographs that receives even more attention is the agonistic pictures, the ones that display impending or actual victimization. This type of photographs is more effective in drawing the public's eye rather than the pictures that do not display any harm. Agonistic images are also associated with influencing the audience to better recall the scene information. In a study about the effects photographs have during news coverage of social protests, Arpan et al. Found that visual information by itself can be a major piece of evidence the public uses when evaluating the issue presented in the articles, as well as the protest groups themselves. So, following this, it is important to evaluate the impact photographs that are published along the articles have on the support of the protesters in the case of Myanmar's Spring Movement. As agonistic images are the ones that draw the most attention, the images of violence that is occurring against the Myanmarese protesters should be used in the experiment of the study to investigate the impact on the support of the movement. Also, these images are the ones that are being used the most in the news coverage of this protest right now. So, using this theoretical framework, I formed the third hypothesis, which is news articles with agonistic frames of news articles with agonistic images of violence against the protesters will result in more support for the movement than articles without such images. As currently the world is going through the COVID-19 pandemic, it seems important to take into consideration the influence COVID-19 could have on the support for the movement. Because of the ongoing protests, the COVID-19 testing has collapsed in Myanmar, although it is known that the country was already struggling to control the rapid spread of the virus before the massive protests where a lot of people are gathering and not following the distancing rules. As well as that, the doctors are now joining the movement and refusing to work until the military gives in to the demands of the protesters. And that results in a lot of people being unable to receive medical services. As this issue is quite recent, there is no previous research to make assumptions of whether the COVID-19 frame will have a positive or negative influence on the support. Therefore, I formed the final hypothesis as followed. The COVID-19 frame will influence the subject's support for the movement. Now I would like to present the method and the design of the study. So the design of the study would be a true experimental design, more specifically post-test only control group design. So the experimental group of subjects would be exposed to the articles with the frames discussed before. To test the first hypothesis, the subjects would be exposed to two articles, one with the civil disobedience movement frame and the other with Myanmar Spring frame. To test the second hypothesis, the subjects would be exposed to an article with human interest frame, for example, stories of the protester who have been injured or suffered loss because of military attacks, and another article without the human interest frame. To test the third hypothesis, the subjects will have to be exposed to the articles with agonistic images of violence against the protesters in Myanmar and one without to compare their response to both articles. And finally, the subjects will have to be exposed to an article with COVID-19 frame and one without to measure if COVID-19 frame has an influence on the support for the movement. After the experiments, the subjects will have to fill in questionnaires to measure their response to this experiment. So these are the references and the articles that I have used to for this study idea. And this is also the references. And this is the end of my presentation of my research idea. Thank you for your attention, and thank you.